bound by fire and sin. Alessia DeSantis had never believed in love, not in their world. But when her father was murdered, when she was thrown into a marriage she did not choose, she realized something dangerous. There was only one man who could protect her. And he was the man she had once betrayed. Marcelo Costa looked at her, unreadable. Then slowly he smiled. "You need a husband," he murmured. "And lucky for you, I'm available." Chapter 1. The Scent of Blood and Roses. The air in the Grand DeSantis villa was thick with the cloying sweetness of roses, a desperate attempt to mask the metallic tang of blood. Alessia DeSantis knelt beside her father's lifeless body, the crimson stain spreading across the pristine marble floor mirroring the blossoming horror in her heart. Don Antonio DeSantis, a man who had commanded respect and fear in equal measure, was now reduced to a cold, still form. His eyes, usually sparkling with shrewd intelligence, were vacant, staring up at the ornate chandelier that seemed to mock the solemnity of the occasion. Alessia's fingers, trembling, traced the outline of his jaw, the skin already losing its warmth. He had been a hard man, a man of few words and even fewer displays of affection, but he had been her father, the bedrock of her existence, the unshakable force that had shaped her life, her world, her very being. Now, that bedrock had crumbled. The villa, usually bustling with activity servants whispering, guards patrolling, the low hum of hushed conversations was eerily silent. Only the muffled sobs of her younger sister, Sophia, broke the stillness. Sophia, ever the fragile one, clung to their Aunt Isabella, her face buried in the older woman's shoulder. Isabella, Antonio's sister, stroked Sophia's hair, her own face a mask of stoic grief, her eyes dry and hard. Isabella had seen too much death in her life. Tears were a luxury she could no longer afford. Alessia, however, felt a strange numbness. She couldn't cry. Not yet. The reality of her father's death hadn't fully sunk in. It felt like a scene from a play, a macabre drama she was forced to watch, unable to look away, unable to participate. She felt detached, floating above the scene, observing the tableau of grief with a clinical, almost unsettling, calm. "They shot him in his study," Isabella said, her voice raspy, breaking the silence. "3 times. In the chest." Alessia didn't need to ask who they were. The DeLucas. The rival family, their sworn enemies for generations. The feud between the DeSantis and the DeLucas was legendary, a bloody tapestry woven with betrayal, revenge, and countless lives lost. This, though, was a declaration of war. An act so brazen, so brutal, it left no room for doubt. A cold dread seeped into Alessia's bones, replacing the numbness. Her father's death wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a strategic move. A decapitation strike. And she, as Antonio's eldest daughter, was now the most vulnerable piece on the board. She rose, her legs unsteady, her silk dress whispering against the marble floor. The scent of roses, once comforting, now suffocated her. She walked towards the window, overlooking the sprawling gardens, the manicured lawns bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. The beauty of the scene was a stark contrast to the ugliness that had unfolded within the villa's walls. From the corner of her eye, she saw Marco, her father's consigliere, approaching. Marco, a man of quiet strength and unwavering loyalty, had been Antonio's right-hand man for decades. His face, usually impassive, was etched with worry. "Alessia," he said, his voice low and respectful, "we need to talk. About the future." The future. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. In their world, the world of the Mafia, the future was rarely a matter of choice. It was dictated by tradition, by obligation, by the intricate dance of power and alliances. And Alessia knew, with a sickening certainty, what her future held. A marriage, Marco confirmed, his gaze unwavering. To secure our position. To solidify alliances. Alessia closed her eyes, the image of her father's lifeless body flashing before her. Marriage. In their world, it was a transaction, a merger, a strategic alliance forged in blood and sealed with vows. Love was an irrelevant, often dangerous, complication. Who? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Marco hesitated, a flicker of something akin to pity in his eyes. Marcello Costa. The name hit her like a physical blow. Marcello Costa. The son of Don Lorenzo Costa, the head of the Costa family, one of the most powerful families in the city. A man she had known briefly years ago. A man she had betrayed. A wave of nausea washed over her. Marcello Costa. The memory of his face, his dark, intense eyes, the way he had looked at her, both with desire and a simmering anger, sent a shiver down her spine. He was dangerous, unpredictable, a force of nature as untamed as the city they inhabited. And he had every reason to hate her. Years ago, when she was a naive, rebellious teenager, she had engaged in a brief, forbidden flirtation with Marcello. It had been a foolish, reckless act, a childish attempt to defy her father's authority. It had ended badly, with accusations, recriminations, and a deepening of the already simmering animosity between the two families. She had been sent away to a finishing school in Switzerland to learn to be a proper mafia daughter. Marcello, she had heard, had become even more ruthless, more hardened, his reputation for violence growing with each passing year. Now, she was to be his wife. A pawn in a deadly game, offered up as a sacrifice to secure her family's survival. He agreed? Alessia asked, her voice trembling slightly. Marco Nariz. Don Lorenzo sees the advantage. A union between our families would be formidable. It would send a message to the De Lucas. And to anyone else who might think we are weak. Alessia looked back at her father's body, the blood now congealing, the roses wilting. A formidable union, built on a foundation of death, betrayal, and a past she desperately wanted to forget. She felt a flicker of defiance, a spark of the rebellious girl she had once been. But it was quickly extinguished by the cold, hard reality of her situation. She had no choice. She was a DeSantis. And in their world, duty always came before desire. Even before fear. She straightened her shoulders, her chin lifting. The numbness was receding, replaced by a steely resolve. She would do what she had to do. She would marry Marcello Costa. She would face her past, her fears, her uncertain future. She would survive. For her family. For her father's legacy. And perhaps, just perhaps, for herself. But tonight, the scent of blood was stronger than the scent of any rose. It hung in the air, a premonition, a reminder of the world she was bound to, a world where love was a weapon and marriage a battlefield. She felt his presence before she even saw him. The weight of the room shifted. Marcello Costa. And as the other men that had filled the room began to clear, she knew that her life had changed forever. Chapter 2. Whispers in the shadows of the past. He moved with a predator's grace, silent and lethal, his presence filling the room even before he spoke. Marcello Costa. Alessia hadn't seen him in 7 years, not since that disastrous night that had shattered their fragile connection and sent her fleeing into exile. He was different now, harder, the youthful arrogance tempered by a chilling self-assurance. The boy she had known was gone, replaced by a man who exuded power and a dangerous, barely contained intensity. He was taller than she remembered, his shoulders broader, his body honed to a lean, muscular strength. He wore a dark suit, impeccably tailored, that accentuated his imposing physique. His hair was still the same raven black, thick and slightly unruly, falling across his forehead in a way that she had once found irresistibly charming. But his eyes were what held her captive. They were the same dark, almost black, intensity, but now they were shadowed, guarded, holding secrets she couldn't decipher. They assessed her, slowly, deliberately, from head to toe, a silent appraisal that made her skin prickle with unease. The room, once filled with the hushed murmurings of family and advisors, was now empty save for the two of them and the lingering ghost of her father. The silence stretched, taut and heavy, punctuated only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. He stopped a few feet away from her, the distance a carefully calculated measure of respect, or perhaps a deliberate reminder of the chasm that separated them. The scent of him reached her, a subtle blend of expensive cologne, dark tobacco, and something else, something indefinably masculine, that stirred a forgotten memory deep within her. "Alessia," he said, his voice a low, resonant murmur that sent a shiver down her spine. It was the same voice she had heard in her dreams, the voice that had haunted her waking hours for years, a voice that could both soothe and threaten. She met his gaze, her chin lifting slightly, refusing to show any sign of weakness. "Marcelo." He smiled then, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was a smile that could charm or intimidate, and she suspected it was designed to do both. "You've grown up," he observed, his gaze lingering on her face. "And you've changed," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. He chuckled, a low, throaty sound that held a hint of mockery. "Life in our world has a way of doing that, wouldn't you agree?" She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on his. She searched for any trace of the boy she had once known, the boy who had made her laugh, the boy who had looked at her with a mixture of admiration and desire. But that boy was buried deep, hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed defenses. "My father is dead," she said, the words blunt, devoid of emotion. She needed to state the obvious, to ground herself in the reality of the situation. "I know," he replied, his voice losing its playful edge. "I offer my condolences." Don Antonio was a formidable man. Alessia almost flinched at the word formidable. It was the same word Marco had used to describe a potential union between their families. A word that spoke of power, of strategy, of everything but love and compassion. "This marriage," she began, her voice tight, "it's a business arrangement." He inclined his head, acknowledging the truth. "Of course. What else could it be?" The coldness in his voice sent a chill through her. She had known this, of course. She had expected it. But hearing him say it so plainly, so dismissively, still stung. "I understand the necessity," she continued, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "But I want to be clear. I will not be a trophy wife. I will not be a silent, obedient shadow." His eyebrows rose slightly, a hint of amusement flickering in his eyes. "I wouldn't expect anything less, Alessia. You always did have a rebellious streak." The mention of her past rebellion, their shared past, hung in the air between them, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken history that bound them together. "That rebellious streak," she said, her voice hardening, "almost cost us both everything." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper, his breath warm against her ear. "And yet, here we are." She held her ground, refusing to be intimidated by his proximity. "Here we are," she echoed, "because our families demand it. Because we have no choice." He straightened, his gaze locking with hers. "Choice is an illusion, Alessia. Especially for people like us. We are born into this life, bound by duty, by loyalty, by the blood that flows in our veins." His words resonated with a chilling truth. She had always known it, deep down, but she had always fought against it, yearning for freedom she could never truly have. "And what about trust?" she asked, the word almost a challenge. "Can there be any trust between us, Marcelo? After everything?" He was silent for a moment, his gaze searching hers, as if trying to decipher the truth behind her question. Then he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "Trust is earned, Alessia, not given. And it is a fragile thing, easily broken." He paused, his eyes darkening. "But perhaps we can build something new, something stronger, on the ashes of the past." His words were both a promise and a threat. A promise of a potential future, a future where they could forge a new alliance, a new understanding, a new something. And a threat, a reminder of the consequences of failure, of the dangers that lurked in the shadows, waiting to consume them. "I need your protection," she said, the words a confession of vulnerability she hadn't intended to reveal. He smiled again, this time a genuine smile, a smile that reached his eyes, transforming his face, making him look almost human. "You have it," he murmured. "And lucky for you, I'm available." The echo of their first meeting. And he stepped back. "I'll send a car for you tomorrow. We'll be married in the family chapel. It will be small, given the circumstances." He tilted his head, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Don't keep me waiting, Alessia." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone once more, in the silent, echoing room, the scent of blood and roses mingling with the ghost of a past she could no longer escape, and the daunting prospect of a future she couldn't predict. The weight of his words, the promise of protection, the subtle threat, settled upon her. He was offering her a shield, but she knew, with a chilling certainty, that it came with a price. A price she wasn't sure she was ready to pay. But she had no choice. The game had begun, and she was a player, whether she liked it or not. And tomorrow, she would become the wife of Marcelo Costa, the man she had once betrayed, the man who now held her fate in his hands. Her breath hitched. Tomorrow. Chapter 3. A marriage of convenience and deceit. The chapel was small, intimate, tucked away in a secluded corner of the Costa estate. It was ancient, the stone walls worn smooth by time, the stained glass windows depicting scenes of saints and martyrs, their faces illuminated by the flickering candlelight. The air was heavy with the scent of incense and old stone, a smell that Alessia associated with both solemnity and a suffocating sense of confinement. She stood before the altar, dressed in a simple, elegant gown of ivory silk. It was a vintage dress, belonging to Marcelo's mother, a woman Alessia had never met, a woman who had died young, leaving behind a legacy of both beauty and tragedy. The dress felt heavy on her, a symbol of the weight of tradition, of the expectations she was now carrying. She hadn't slept the night before. The image of her father's lifeless body had haunted her dreams, intermingled with the image of Marcelo's face, his dark eyes both alluring and menacing. She had spent the morning in a daze, moving through the motions of preparation, her mind numb, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Sophia, her sister, had tried to comfort her, her own eyes red-rimmed and swollen with grief. But Alessia had pushed her away, unable to bear the weight of her sister's sorrow, unable to offer any comfort in return. She felt isolated, alone, trapped in a gilded cage of her own making. The ceremony was brief, devoid of the usual fanfare and extravagance that accompanied mafia weddings. There were no crowds of guests, no lavish feast, no celebratory music. Only a handful of family members were present, their faces somber, their eyes watchful. Don Lorenzo Costa, Marcelo's father, stood beside his son, his face an impassive mask, his presence radiating a quiet, yet formidable, power. Isabella, Alessia's aunt, stood behind her, her hand resting lightly on Alessia's shoulder, a silent gesture of support. Marcelo stood beside her, tall and imposing, his dark suit a stark contrast to her ivory gown. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the priest, his expression unreadable. She felt his presence, though, a palpable energy that radiated from him, a mixture of strength and something else, something she couldn't quite define. The priest, an old, frail man with a voice that trembled slightly, recited the vows, his words echoing in the silent chapel. Alessia repeated the words mechanically, her voice barely a whisper, her mind miles away. She felt like a puppet, her strings being pulled by forces beyond her control. When it came time to exchange rings, Marcelo took her hand, his fingers cold and strong, closing around hers. The ring, a heavy gold band set with a single, flawless diamond, felt like a shackle, binding her to him, to his family, to a life she hadn't chosen. "With this ring, I thee wed," he said, his voice low and steady, his gaze finally meeting hers. His eyes were dark, intense, holding a depth of emotion she couldn't decipher. Was it regret, resignation, or something else entirely? She looked at the ring, the diamond sparkling in the candlelight, a symbol of wealth, of power, of a commitment that was both sacred and terrifying. She thought of her father, of the sacrifice he had made, of the legacy she was now obligated to uphold. With this ring, I thee wed, she echoed, her voice trembling slightly, her gaze locking with his. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a fleeting moment of vulnerability, quickly masked by his usual guarded expression. The priest pronounced them husband and wife, his words sealing their fate. Marcello leaned down, his lips brushing against hers, a brief, formal kiss that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't a kiss of passion, of love, of desire. It was a kiss of possession, of obligation, of a pact sealed in blood. As they turned to face the small gathering, Alessia felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She was now Alessia Costa, the wife of Marcello Costa, a woman bound to a man she barely knew, a man she had once betrayed, a man who held her future in his hands. The small reception was held in the Costa Villa's grand dining room. The room was opulent, with high ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and walls adorned with priceless artwork. But the atmosphere was subdued, the conversation muted, the celebration tinged with a sense of unease. Alessia sat beside Marcello at the head of the long, mahogany table, feeling like a stranger in a foreign land. She picked at the food on her plate, unable to swallow, her stomach churning with anxiety. She felt Marcello's gaze on her, his eyes watchful, assessing, as if trying to gauge her every thought, her every emotion. Don Lorenzo, seated across from them, raised his glass in a toast. To the newly married couple, he said, his voice booming, filling the room. May their union bring strength and prosperity to our families. The others echoed his words, their glasses clinking, the sound hollow and empty to Alessia's ears. She forced a smile, her lips feeling stiff and unnatural. Thank you, Father, Marcello replied, his voice smooth, his expression unreadable. He raised his glass to Alessia, his eyes meeting hers. To my wife, he said, his voice low, intimate, a subtle challenge in his gaze. She met his challenge, her chin lifting slightly. To my husband, she echoed, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her heart. The evening dragged on, an endless parade of polite conversations, forced smiles, and veiled glances. Alessia felt like an actress, playing a role she hadn't rehearsed, surrounded by people she didn't trust, bound to a man she feared. She caught snippets of conversations, whispers of alliances, of strategies, of the ongoing feud with the DeLucas. She realized that her marriage was more than just a personal transaction, it was a political maneuver, a strategic move in a deadly game. As the evening drew to a close, Marcello led her to their private suite, a lavishly decorated apartment within the Costa Villa. The suite was opulent, with a large bedroom, a sitting room, and a balcony overlooking the gardens. But it felt like a prison, a gilded cage where she would be confined, watched, controlled. He closed the door, with a click that sounded final. He turned to face her, his expression softening slightly. Are you all right, Alessia? She looked at him, her eyes searching his. Am I supposed to be? He was quiet. She knew the answer. No. She was trapped. She was his. You look tired, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. Get some rest. We have a long journey ahead of us. A long journey. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. A journey into the unknown, into a life she hadn't chosen, into a marriage built on convenience and deceit. She felt a surge of fear, of despair, of a longing for a life she could never have. But she masked it, her face a carefully constructed mask of composure. She was a DeSantis and now a Costa, and she would not show weakness. Not to him. Not to anyone. She nodded, a silent acknowledgement of his words, and turned away, walking towards the bedroom, her heart heavy, her future uncertain. But as she moved, she was calculating. She had married him out of duty, but she would find her own power within this union. She would not be a victim. She would be a survivor. And somehow, she would find a way to navigate this treacherous path, to protect herself, her family, and perhaps even to find a semblance of peace in this world of blood and roses. The first day was over, but it was only the beginning. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that the true test was yet to come. Chapter 4. The Unseen Scars of Marcelo Costa. The first few weeks of their marriage were a strange, unsettling dance. Alessia and Marcelo circled each other cautiously, like wary predators, each assessing the other's strengths and weaknesses, each probing for vulnerabilities. They shared meals, exchanged polite conversation, and slept in the same bed, a vast expanse of silk and linen separating them, a silent testament to the chasm that still existed between them. Alessia spent her days exploring the Costa estate, familiarizing herself with its labyrinthine corridors, its hidden gardens, its silent, watchful staff. She felt like an intruder, an outsider, constantly aware of the eyes that followed her every move, the whispers that trailed behind her. She tried to establish a routine, to find a semblance of normalcy in this strange, unfamiliar world. She spent hours in the library, losing herself in the pages of ancient books, seeking solace in the stories of others, in the echoes of lives lived and lost. She rode horses in the sprawling paddocks, feeling a fleeting sense of freedom as the wind whipped through her hair, the powerful animal beneath her responding to her every command. She also began to learn more about the Costa family, about their history, their traditions, their intricate web of alliances and rivalries. She listened, observed, absorbed, piecing together the puzzle of this powerful, enigmatic clan, trying to understand the forces that shaped their lives, their destinies. Marcelo, however, remained an enigma. He was polite, courteous, even considerate at times, but he maintained a distance, a carefully constructed wall around his emotions, his thoughts, his past. He was a master of control, his face an impassive mask, his eyes revealing nothing of his inner world. He spent most of his days immersed in the family business, attending meetings, making deals, issuing orders, his presence commanding respect and fear in equal measure. He was a natural leader, a man born to power, his authority unquestioned, his decisions absolute. Alessia often caught glimpses of him, across the dining table, in the hallways, in the gardens, his face etched with concentration, his brow furrowed in thought, his eyes shadowed with a burden she couldn't comprehend. She wondered about his past, about the experiences that had shaped him, that had hardened him, that had turned him into the man he was today. She knew about his reputation, of course. She had heard the whispers, the rumors, the stories of his ruthlessness, his violence, his unwavering loyalty to his family. But she also sensed something else, something hidden beneath the surface, a vulnerability, a pain, a loneliness that he kept carefully concealed. One evening, she found him in the study, standing by the window, staring out at the darkened gardens. The room was dimly lit, a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls, illuminating his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the strong curve of his neck. He was holding a glass of whiskey, swirling the amber liquid, his gaze lost in the darkness beyond. She hesitated at the doorway, unsure whether to intrude. He seemed lost in his own world, his thoughts miles away, his shoulders slumped with a weariness she hadn't seen before. "Marcelo?" she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. He turned, startled, his eyes widening slightly as he saw her. He quickly composed himself, his expression returning to its usual guarded mask. "Alessia," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I didn't hear you come in." She stepped into the room, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet. "I couldn't sleep," she said, her voice hesitant. He nodded, his gaze returning to the window. "Neither can I." A silence fell between them, a comfortable silence, different from the usual tension that permeated their interactions. She walked towards him, stopping a few feet away, her gaze following his, looking out at the darkened gardens, the shadows shifting in the moonlight. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her voice soft, curious. He hesitated, as if unsure whether to answer. Then he gave a shrug, his shoulders lifting slightly. "The past," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "The future." The weight of responsibility. She understood that weight. She felt it too, the burden of her family's legacy, the expectations that rested upon her shoulders. "It's a heavy burden," she said, her voice echoing his thoughts. He turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. "You carry it well," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. She met his gaze, her chin lifting slightly. "I have to," she said, her voice steady. "We both do." He nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He took a sip of his whiskey, his gaze lingering on her face. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, the question hesitant, almost fearful. "This life? The choices we've made? The choices that were made for us?" He was silent for a long moment, his gaze searching hers, as if trying to decipher the truth behind her question. Then, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Regret is a useless emotion, Alessia. It changes nothing. It only weakens you. But do you ever wonder what if?" She persisted, her voice barely a whisper. "What if we had been born into a different world? What if we had had a choice?" He looked at her, his eyes darkening, a flicker of pain crossing his face. "We are who we are, Alessia," he said, his voice low, intense. "We cannot escape our fate. We can only embrace it, or be consumed by it." He stepped closer, but he paused, his gaze boring into her. "That past shaped me, made me who I am." He was close enough for her to reach out and take his hand, but she didn't. He turned away again, his gaze returning to the darkened gardens, his profile silhouetted against the faint glow of the moon. She saw a flicker of vulnerability, a glimpse of the unseen scars he carried, the hidden wounds that had shaped him, that had made him the man he was. And in that moment, she felt a connection to him, a shared understanding, a recognition of the burdens they both carried, the sacrifices they had both made. A bond, forged not in love, but in the shared reality of their world, a world of blood and roses, of duty and deceit, of power and pain. It would begin here, the opening of a soul, the trust, or the test, or both. Chapter 5. Alessia's Dance with Danger. Alessia found herself increasingly drawn into the intricate web of mafia politics. While Marcello tried to shield her from the darker aspects of their world, he also recognized her intelligence, her sharp instincts, and her unwavering loyalty to her family. He began to include her in certain discussions, seeking her opinion on matters of strategy, of alliances, of potential threats. She discovered a hidden talent for this world, a capacity for understanding the complex dynamics of power, the subtle nuances of negotiation, the unspoken language of threats and promises. She was a quick learner, absorbing information like a sponge, analyzing situations with a clarity and insight that surprised even Marcello. She also began to understand the true extent of the threat posed by the DeLucas. The murder of her father had not been an isolated incident, it was part of a larger plan, a calculated campaign to destabilize the DeSantis and Costa families, to seize control of their territories, their businesses, their power. One evening, Marcello brought her to a meeting with his capi, the lieutenants who controlled various aspects of the Costa family's operations. The meeting was held in a secure room, hidden deep within the villa, a room designed for secrecy, for strategy, for war. Alessia sat beside Marcello at the head of the long table, her presence a silent statement of her position, of her growing influence within the family. The capi, a group of hardened, experienced men, regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and respect. They knew her history, her connection to the DeSantis family, her marriage to Marcello. They also knew that she was not to be underestimated. The discussion centered on the DeLucas' recent movements, their attempts to encroach on Costa territory, their efforts to recruit allies from other families. The atmosphere in the room was tense, the air thick with the unspoken threat of violence. "They're testing us," said one of the capi, a man named Sal, his face scarred, his eyes cold. "They're probing for weaknesses. They want to see how we react." "We need to send a message," said another. Enzo, a younger man, his voice filled with a barely contained anger. "We need to show them that we are not afraid, that we will not back down." Marcelo listened to the various opinions, his face impassive, his eyes revealing nothing of his thoughts. Alessia watched him, admiring his control, his ability to remain calm in the face of pressure, his strategic mind working, calculating, assessing. "We will not react rashly," Marcelo said, his voice calm, but firm. "We will not be provoked into making a mistake. We will respond strategically, deliberately, at a time and place of our choosing." He turned to Alessia, his gaze seeking hers. "What do you think, Alessia?" She met his gaze, her mind racing, analyzing the situation. She had listened carefully to the discussion, absorbing the information, weighing the options. "They want us to react," she said, her voice steady, her gaze meeting the eyes of the Capi, one by one. "They want to draw us into a fight on their terms. We should not give them what they want." She paused, her mind working, formulating a plan. Instead, she continued, "We should focus on their weaknesses. We should exploit their vulnerabilities. We should strike where they least expect it." She outlined her plan, a daring, audacious strategy that involved a combination of deception, misdirection, and a carefully targeted strike against a key DeLuca operation. The Capi listened, their initial skepticism slowly giving way to a grudging respect. Marcelo watched her, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. He had known she was intelligent, but he hadn't realized the extent of her strategic brilliance, her ability to think like a mafia don, to see the bigger picture, to anticipate her enemy's moves. "It's risky," Sal said, his voice hesitant. "But it could work." "It's the only way," Alessia countered, her voice firm. "We need to show them that we are not to be trifled with, that we are stronger than they think." Marcelo nodded, his decision made. "We will proceed with Alessia's plan," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Prepare your men. We strike in 3 days." The meeting adjourned, the Capi dispersing, their faces grim, their minds focused on the task ahead. Alessia remained seated, her heart pounding, her adrenaline surging. She had just taken a major step, a dangerous step, into the heart of the mafia world. She had crossed a line, from observer to participant, from pawn to player. Marcelo turned to her, his gaze intense. "You were magnificent," he said, his voice low, a hint of pride in his tone. She met his gaze, her chin lifting slightly. "I did what was necessary," she said, her voice steady. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, transforming his face. "You are a DeSantis," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "And Acosta." He reached for her hand, his fingers closing over hers. It was the first truly voluntary, connected touch. He did not let go. She looked at their joined hands, a symbol of their partnership, their alliance, their shared destiny. She felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of belonging, of purpose, of a connection she hadn't expected to find. But she also knew that this was just the beginning. The dance with danger had begun, and she was now a willing, if somewhat apprehensive, participant. She had tasted power, she had felt the thrill of strategy, the adrenaline of risk. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that there was no turning back. She was in this world, for better or for worse, and she would fight for her place, for her family, for her future. Even if it meant walking a tightrope between life and death, between love and betrayal, between the past she couldn't escape and the future she couldn't predict. She was Alessia Costa, and she would not be afraid. This plan. It was her first. It would not be her last. But would it work? Chapter 6. Echoes of betrayal in the night. The night of the planned strike was heavy with tension. Alessia paced restlessly in their suite, unable to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. The city outside was shrouded in darkness, the silence broken only by the occasional wail of a siren, a distant reminder of the violence that lurked beneath the surface of their world. Marcelo had left hours ago, leading his men on the carefully orchestrated operation against the DeLucas. He had tried to reassure her, telling her that everything was under control, that he would be back before dawn. But she knew the risks, the dangers, the ever-present threat of betrayal. She walked to the balcony, looking out at the city lights, her mind racing, imagining the scenarios unfolding, the potential for disaster, the consequences of failure. She prayed for his safety, for the success of their plan, for a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. She had tried to distract herself, reading, sketching, even attempting to sleep, but her mind refused to cooperate. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind, every distant sound made her jump, her heart pounding, her senses on high alert. She thought of Marcelo, of his strength, his courage, his unwavering determination. She admired him, respected him, even feared him. But she also felt something else, something she couldn't quite define, a growing connection, a sense of shared purpose, a flicker of affection. She replayed their conversation from the previous night, his words echoing in her mind. "You are a DeSantis." And Acosta. The pride in his voice, the warmth in his eyes, the way he had held her hand, a silent promise of protection, of partnership. She realized that she was starting to trust him, to rely on him, to see him not just as her husband, not just as the head of the Costa family, but as a man, a complex, flawed, but ultimately honorable man. A sudden noise startled her, pulling her back to the present. It sounded like a muffled thud, coming from somewhere within the villa. She froze, her heart pounding, her senses straining. She listened intently, trying to identify the source of the sound, her mind conjuring images of intruders, of assassins, of a DeLuca counterattack. She grabbed a small, ornate dagger from a drawer in her bedside table, a gift from Marcelo, a symbol of protection, of her status within the family. She held it tightly, her hand trembling slightly, her eyes scanning the shadows, her body poised for action. She moved silently through the suite, her bare feet making no sound on the thick carpet, her senses on high alert. She checked the doors, the windows, the balconies, finding nothing amiss. The villa was silent, seemingly deserted. Then, she heard it again, the same muffled thud, this time closer, coming from the direction of Marcelo's study. She hesitated, her heart pounding, her mind racing. Should she investigate? Or should she wait for the guards to respond? She knew that Marcelo had left strict instructions for the guards to protect her, to keep her safe at all costs. But she also knew that she couldn't stand idly by, waiting for someone else to take action. She was a DeSantis, a Costa, and she would not cower in fear. She took a deep breath, steeling her nerves, and moved towards the study, her dagger held firmly in her hand, her body tense, ready for anything. She reached the door, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the knob. She paused, listening intently, hearing nothing but the frantic beating of her own heart. She took another deep breath, pushed the door open, and stepped into the study. The room was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from the moon, shining through the large window, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. She scanned the room, her eyes adjusting to the darkness, her dagger held high. She saw nothing, no one, only the familiar furniture, the bookshelves, the desk, the fireplace. Then she saw it. A figure, slumped on the floor, near the fireplace, hidden in the shadows. She moved closer, her heart pounding, her dagger raised, her mind racing. She recognized the figure. It was Marco, Marcelo's consigliere, his most trusted advisor, the man who had been like a second father to him. He was lying on his side, his body still, his face pale, his eyes closed. Alessia knelt beside him, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch him. She felt for a pulse, her fingers pressing against his neck, searching for a sign of life. Nothing. He was dead. A wave of nausea washed over her, her head spinning, her vision blurring. She stared at Marco's lifeless body, her mind struggling to comprehend the reality of what she was seeing. She noticed a small, dark stain on his shirt, near his heart. A bullet wound. He had been shot, just like her father. She looked around the room, her eyes searching for clues, for any sign of the killer. She saw nothing, no weapon, no forced entry, no indication of a struggle. Then she noticed something else. A small, folded piece of paper, lying on the floor, near Marco's outstretched hand. She picked it up, her fingers trembling as she unfolded it. It was a note, written in a hurried, almost illegible scrawl. She recognized the handwriting. It was Marcello's. The note contained a single sentence: "Trust no one." Alessia stared at the note, her mind reeling, her heart pounding. Trust no one. The words echoed in her mind, a chilling warning, a terrifying revelation. Betrayal. It had come from within. Someone in Marcello's inner circle, someone he trusted, someone he considered family, had betrayed him, had murdered Marco, and was likely plotting against him, against them. She looked at Marco's lifeless body, her eyes filling with tears. She felt a surge of anger, of grief, of a desperate need for revenge. She knew that she had to warn Marcello, to tell him about the betrayal, to protect him from the danger that lurked within his own ranks. But how? He was out there, in the middle of a dangerous operation, surrounded by potential enemies, unable to be reached. She had to find a way to contact him, a way to warn him, before it was too late. She was alone, in the dark, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that the night was far from over. The echoes of betrayal were ringing, and she was caught in the middle of a deadly game, a game where trust was a luxury, and survival was the only prize. But who?
And why?
And how could she warn the man she was slowly falling in love with, before the betrayal consumed them all? Chapter 7. The Weight of Family Secrets. Alessia spent the rest of the night in a state of heightened anxiety, her mind racing, trying to piece together the puzzle of Marco's murder and Marcello's cryptic note. She knew she couldn't stay in the villa, it was no longer safe. Someone within the Costa household was a traitor, and she couldn't risk being discovered. She changed into dark, inconspicuous clothing, packed a small bag with essentials, and slipped out of the villa under the cover of darkness. She avoided the main roads, sticking to the shadows, her senses on high alert, her dagger concealed beneath her cloak. She headed towards the old DeSantis estate, her childhood home, a place that had been abandoned after her father's death. It was a risky move. The DeLucas could be watching the property, hoping to catch her unawares. But she had nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to. The estate was shrouded in darkness, the overgrown gardens casting eerie shadows, the empty windows staring out like vacant eyes. The house itself was silent, deserted, a ghost of its former self. Alessia felt a pang of sadness as she entered the familiar rooms, the memories of her childhood flooding back, mingling with the grief of her father's death and the fear of her current predicament. She found a hidden room, a secret chamber behind a bookshelf in her father's study, a place where he had kept his most sensitive documents, his most closely guarded secrets. She lit a single candle, the flickering flame casting long shadows across the walls, illuminating the dust-covered furniture, the forgotten relics of her family's past. She began to search through her father's papers, looking for any clue, any hint, any information that might shed light on the current situation, on the betrayal that had cost Marco his life and threatened Marcello's. She found old ledgers, detailing the DeSantis family's business dealings, their alliances, their rivalries. She found letters, correspondence with other mafia families, with politicians, with law enforcement officials. She found photographs, portraits of her ancestors, their faces stern, their eyes filled with a mixture of pride and determination. And then, she found it, a small, locked box, hidden at the back of a drawer. She recognized the box. It was her father's most prized possession, a repository of his most personal secrets. She had never seen the key, never known what it contained. She tried to force the lock, but it was too strong. She searched the room, frantically, desperately, looking for the key, her heart pounding, her mind racing. Finally, she found it, hidden inside a hollowed-out book, a copy of Machiavelli's The Prince, a fitting hiding place for a mafia don's secrets. She took the key, her hand trembling as she inserted it into the lock. She turned the key, the lock clicking open, revealing the contents of the box. Inside, she found a collection of documents, photographs, and letters, all carefully preserved, all revealing a hidden history, a secret world she had never known. She found evidence of her father's secret dealings with the DeLucas, a long-standing arrangement, a pact of non-aggression, a collaboration that had spanned decades. She found proof of his involvement in illegal activities, in corruption, in violence, in acts that shattered her image of him, that destroyed the illusion of the honorable man she had believed him to be. And then, she found a letter, addressed to Marcelo, dated just a few weeks before her father's death. The letter revealed a shocking truth, a secret that had been buried for years, a secret that would change everything. Marcelo was not Lorenzo Costa's son. He was Antonio DeSantis' son, Alessia's half-brother. Alessia stared at the letter, her mind reeling, her heart pounding, her world collapsing around her. The words swam before her eyes, the truth hitting her like a physical blow. Marcelo, her husband, her half-brother, the forbidden attraction, the connection she had felt, the sense of shared destiny. It all made sense now. It was a blood tie, a familial bond, a connection that transcended their marriage, their family's rivalry, their entire world. But it was also a betrayal, a lie, a deception that had been perpetrated for decades, a secret that had been kept hidden from them both. She thought of Marcelo, of his strength, his courage, his unwavering loyalty to his family. She thought of the burden he carried, the responsibility he felt, the weight of a legacy that was not rightfully his. She realized that she had to tell him, to reveal the truth, to expose the lies that had shaped their lives. But she also knew that it would destroy him, that it would shatter his world, that it would break his heart. She was torn, conflicted, trapped between her duty to tell the truth and her desire to protect him from the pain it would cause. She looked at the letter, the evidence of her father's deception, of the secret that had bound them together, that had made them both pawns in a deadly game. She knew that she had to make a choice that would determine their future, a choice that could save them or destroy them both. She had to decide whether to reveal the truth, to expose the lies, to risk everything, or to keep the secret, to protect Marcelo, to maintain the illusion, to live with the burden of her knowledge. The weight of the family's secrets pressed down on her, crushing her. And the clock was ticking. Marcelo was in danger. She had to act. But how could she tell him the truth, when the truth was the most dangerous weapon of all? The answer was unclear. But one thing was certain. Their lives would never be the same. Chapter 8. A glimmer of trust in the darkness. Alessia knew she had to reach Marcelo, but communication was impossible. He was deep in enemy territory, surrounded by potential traitors, his every move likely monitored. She couldn't risk using phones, radios, or any conventional means of contact. She decided to use a method her father had taught her, a clandestine system of communication used by the DeSantis family for generations. It involved a series of coded messages, left in specific locations, known only to a select few. It was slow, unreliable, but it was the safest option she had. She crafted a message, carefully encoding the information about Marco's murder, the betrayal within the Costa family, and the shocking revelation about Marcelo's true parentage. She used a complex cipher, a combination of numbers, letters, and symbols, known only to her and her father. She knew that if the message fell into the wrong hands, it would be indecipherable, protecting them both from further danger. She left the message in a designated location, a hidden compartment beneath a statue in a secluded garden, a place frequented by Marcelo in his youth. She prayed that he would find it, that he would understand it, that he would believe it. She then returned to the abandoned DeSantis estate, her only refuge, her only safe haven. She spent the next few days in a state of agonizing suspense, waiting for a response, for a sign, for any indication that Marcelo had received her message. She barely slept, barely ate, her mind consumed by worry, by fear, by the weight of the secrets she carried. She paced restlessly through the empty rooms, the silence amplifying her anxiety, the shadows deepening her despair. She thought of Marcelo, of his strength, his resilience, his vulnerability. She imagined him, fighting for his life, unaware of the betrayal that surrounded him, unaware of the truth about his past. She replayed their moments together, the brief encounters, the fleeting touches, the unspoken connection. She realized that she was falling in love with him, despite everything, despite the forbidden nature of their relationship, despite the dangers that loomed. She knew that their love was a dangerous, impossible dream, a fragile flame flickering in the darkness. But it was also a source of strength, of hope, of a reason to keep fighting, to keep surviving. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she received a response. A single word, encoded in the same cipher, left in the same location, acknowledged. It was a brief, cryptic message, but it was enough. He had received her message, he understood it, he believed it. Relief washed over her, a wave of gratitude, of hope, of a renewed sense of determination. She knew that he would act, that he would take steps to protect himself, to uncover the traitor, to confront the truth. But she also knew that the danger was far from over. The DeLucas were still out there, plotting, scheming, waiting for an opportunity to strike. The traitor within the Costa family was still at large, a hidden enemy, a threat that could destroy them all. She decided to take a risk, to reach out to someone she thought she could trust, someone outside of the Costa family, someone who had been loyal to her father. She contacted Isabella, her aunt Antonio's sister, the woman who had raised her, who had been a mother figure to her, a woman she had always believed to be strong, unwavering, trustworthy. She arranged a secret meeting in a neutral location, a small, secluded cafe in a quiet neighborhood. She knew that it was a gamble, that Isabella could be involved in the betrayal, that she could be walking into a trap. But she had to take the chance. She needed an ally, someone she could confide in, someone who could help her navigate this treacherous path. They met at the cafe, their conversation hushed, their eyes watchful, their senses on high alert. Alessia told Isabella everything about Marco's murder, about Marcello's note, about the secret she had discovered in her father's papers. Isabella listened, her face a mask of shock, of disbelief, of a growing horror. She had known about Antonio's secret dealings with the DeLucas, but she had never suspected the truth about Marcello's parentage. "It cannot be," she whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes filling with tears. Antonio would never, he couldn't. Alessia handed her the letter, the proof of her father's deception, the evidence that could not be denied. Isabella read the letter, her hands shaking, her face paling, her world crumbling around her. I don't understand," she said, her voice choked with emotion.
Why?
Why would he do this? Why would he keep such a secret? Alessia didn't have the answers. She could only speculate, guess, imagine the reasons behind her father's actions. Perhaps it had been a power play, a way to control both families, to manipulate events to his advantage. Perhaps it had been a moment of weakness, a forbidden love affair, a secret that had spiraled out of control. "It doesn't matter why," Alessia said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. "What matters is that we know the truth. And we have to protect Marcello." Isabella nodded, her resolve returning, her strength resurfacing. She was a DeSantis, a woman of courage, of resilience, of unwavering loyalty. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady, her eyes filled with determination. Alessia outlined her plan, a daring, risky strategy to expose the traitor, to protect Marcello, to reclaim their family's honor. It was a long shot, a gamble, a desperate attempt to turn the tables on their enemies. But it was their only hope, a glimmer of trust in this landscape of darkness. And it was a start. They had an ally. But was it enough? And could they truly trust Isabella, when trust itself was the rarest commodity of all? The answer remained hidden, shrouded in the shadows of the past and the uncertainties of the future. But they would fight. Together. Chapter 9. The Price of Protection and Loyalty. Alessia and Isabella began to work together, meticulously planning their next move. They knew they had to be careful, that any misstep could be fatal. They communicated in code, met in secret locations, and trusted no one but each other. Their first priority was to identify the traitor within the Costa family. They suspected several individuals, but they needed proof, concrete evidence that would withstand scrutiny and allow Marcello to act decisively. Isabella used her connections within the family, her years of experience, her intimate knowledge of the inner workings of the Costa organization, to gather information. She discreetly questioned servants, guards, and even some of the lower-ranking capi, piecing together fragments of information, searching for any inconsistencies, any clues that might point to the traitor. Alessia, meanwhile, focused on the De Lucas. She knew that they were somehow involved in Marco's murder, that they were pulling the strings, manipulating events to their advantage. She used her father's old contacts, his network of informants, to gather intelligence on the De Lucas movements, their plans, their weaknesses. It was a dangerous game, a dance with shadows, a constant balancing act between gathering information and avoiding detection. Alessia and Isabella were walking a tightrope, knowing that one wrong move could send them plummeting into the abyss. They discovered that the traitor was closer than they had initially thought. It was Enzo, one of Marcello's capi, the young, ambitious man who had advocated for a violent response to the De Lucas provocations. Enzo had been secretly working with the De Lucas for months, feeding them information, sabotaging Costa operations, and ultimately, orchestrating Marco's murder. The motive was simple: greed and ambition. Enzo had been promised a significant share of the Costa territory and a position of power within the De Luca organization in exchange for his betrayal. Alessia and Isabella gathered irrefutable evidence of Enzo's treachery, including recordings of his conversations with De Luca representatives, financial records documenting illicit transactions, and eyewitness testimony from a disgruntled former associate. They presented the evidence to Marcello, who had returned from his operation, shaken by Marco's death and Alessia's cryptic message, but determined to uncover the truth. Marcello was devastated by Enzo's betrayal. He had trusted Enzo, had considered him a loyal lieutenant, a friend. The revelation that Enzo had been responsible for Marco's death, for the threat to his family, filled him with rage and a profound sense of sadness. He acted swiftly and decisively. Enzo was summoned to a meeting, confronted with the evidence of his treachery, and given a chance to explain himself. Enzo denied the accusations, but his lies were transparent, his guilt undeniable. Marcello, with a heavy heart, ordered Enzo's execution. It was a brutal but necessary act, a demonstration of his unwavering commitment to loyalty, a warning to anyone else who might be tempted to betray him. The execution of Enzo sent a shockwave through the Costa family. It was a clear message that betrayal would not be tolerated, that loyalty was paramount, that Marcello was a force to be reckoned with. But the danger was not over. The De Lucas were still out there, and they were now more determined than ever to destroy the Costas and the DeSantises. They knew that their plan had been exposed, that their agent within the Costa family had been eliminated. They would be seeking revenge. Alessia and Marcello, now united by a shared purpose and a growing bond of trust, prepared for the inevitable confrontation. They knew that the De Lucas would strike again, and they had to be ready. Marcello strengthened the defenses of the Costa estate, increased security, and put his men on high alert. Alessia, meanwhile, continued to gather intelligence, working with Isabella to anticipate the De Lucas' next move. They also had to deal with the revelation of Marcello's true parentage. Alessia had told Marcello the truth, showing him the letters she had found in her father's secret box. Marcello was stunned, devastated, his world turned upside down. He had always believed himself to be Lorenzo Costa's son, had grown up with that identity, that legacy. To discover that his true father was Antonio DeSantis, his family's sworn enemy, was a shock that shook him to his core. He struggled to accept the truth, to reconcile his past with his present, to understand the implications of this revelation. He felt betrayed by both his fathers, by Lorenzo for keeping the secret, by Antonio for the deception that had shaped his life. Alessia supported him, comforted him, helped him to process his emotions, to come to terms with the truth. She shared her own feelings of confusion, of anger, of a strange sense of connection to him, a bond that was both forbidden and undeniable. They talked for hours, sharing their memories, their fears, their hopes for the future. They began to understand each other, to trust each other, to rely on each other in a way they had never thought possible. They knew that their relationship was complicated, unconventional, fraught with danger. But they also knew that they had a connection, a bond, a love that transcended their family's rivalry, their past betrayals, their uncertain future. They did love each other, but it was more a love of two humans connected by fate, connected by circumstance. And now they are forced to continue to pay that price. They were bound together, by blood, by loyalty, by a shared destiny. And they would face the future together, whatever it may hold. The price of protection, the weight of loyalty, the burden of family secrets, it was all theirs to bear. Together. But would it be enough to withstand the storm that was coming? The DeLucas were preparing to strike. And the Costas and DeSantises would be ready. But at what cost? The answer was yet to be revealed. But the price, they knew, would be high. Chapter 10. Unveiling the Enemy Within. Despite Enzo's elimination, a lingering unease persisted. Alessia felt it, a prickling at the back of her neck, a sense that the danger hadn't fully passed. Marcelo, too, was on edge, his senses heightened, his trust fractured. Marco's dying words, "Trust no one," echoed in both their minds. Alessia continued to delve into her father's papers, searching for any further clues, any overlooked details that might shed light on the remaining threats. She discovered a hidden compartment in her father's desk containing a series of coded messages exchanged with an unknown individual. The messages were cryptic, filled with veiled references and allusions, but Alessia, with her knowledge of her father's cipher, was able to decipher them. She discovered that her father had been involved in a secret alliance, not just with the DeLucas, but with someone else, someone within the Costa family, someone even closer than Enzo. The messages hinted at a long-standing conspiracy, a plot to control both the DeSantis and Costa families, to manipulate events to their advantage, to amass power and wealth at any cost. The unknown individual was referred to only by a codename, Il Serpent the Serpent. Alessia and Marcelo realized that they were facing a far more dangerous and insidious enemy than they had imagined. Il Serpent was someone within their inner circle, someone they trusted, someone who had been playing them all along. They began to suspect everyone, their closest advisors, their most loyal capi, even members of their own family. The paranoia was suffocating, the mistrust poisoning the atmosphere, making it impossible to know who to believe, who to rely on. Isabella, initially a source of strength and support, became increasingly withdrawn, her behavior erratic, her answers evasive. Alessia began to suspect her aunt, to wonder if Isabella was somehow involved in the conspiracy, if she was, in fact, Illinois Serpent. It was a painful thought, a betrayal that would cut deeper than any other. Alessia had always trusted Isabella, had looked up to her, had considered her a second mother. To suspect her of such treachery was agonizing, but she couldn't ignore the evidence, the subtle clues that pointed in Isabella's direction. Marcelo, too, was struggling with the possibility of Isabella's betrayal. He had known Isabella all his life, had respected her, had trusted her implicitly. To suspect her of being Il Serpent was a blow to his already fractured sense of trust. They decided to confront Isabella, to present her with the evidence they had gathered, to give her a chance to explain herself. It was a risky move, a gamble that could expose their suspicions and put them in even greater danger. They met with Isabella in the secret room in the old DeSantis estate, the same room where Alessia had discovered her father's secrets. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with suspicion, with fear, with the unspoken threat of betrayal. Alessia presented the evidence, the coded messages, the circumstantial clues, the inconsistencies in Isabella's behavior. Isabella listened, her face paling, her eyes widening in shock, in disbelief, in a growing horror. This is madness," she whispered, her voice trembling, her hands shaking. "You suspect me? Of betraying my own brother? Of working with the DeLucas? Of being Il Serpent?" Alessia met her gaze, her heart aching, her mind torn between her suspicions and her love for her aunt. "We have to consider every possibility, Isabella," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We have to know the truth." Isabella broke down, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking with sobs. She denied the accusations, vehemently, passionately, swearing her innocence, her loyalty to her family, her love for Alessia and Marcello. "I would never betray you," she cried, her voice choked with emotion. "I would never betray my brother's memory. I would never work with the De Lucas. I am not Il Serpent." Marcello watched her, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He wanted to believe her, to trust her, to dismiss the suspicions as unfounded. But he couldn't ignore the evidence, the nagging doubts that lingered in his mind. "Then who is it, Isabella?" he asked, his voice low, intense. "Who is Il Serpent? Who is betraying us?" Isabella looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. She hesitated, her gaze darting around the room, as if searching for an answer, for an escape. Then, she whispered a name that shocked them both, a name that shattered their remaining illusions, a name that revealed the true extent of the conspiracy. "Lorenzo," she said, her voice barely audible. "Lorenzo Costa. He is Il Serpent, Marcello's father. The man he had respected, admired, obeyed all his life. The man he had believed to be his father. The man who had orchestrated the entire conspiracy, who had manipulated events to his advantage, who had betrayed them all." The revelation hit them like a physical blow, leaving them stunned, speechless, their world crumbling around them. The enemy was within. And it was the man Marcello had called father. The truth was out, but the danger was far from over. Lorenzo Costa, Il Serpente, the master manipulator, the architect of their destruction. And now they had to face him. But how could they defeat a man who had controlled their lives for so long, a man who held all the cards, a man who was willing to do anything to achieve his goals? The answer was unclear. But one thing was certain. The battle for their lives, for their families, for their future, had just begun. And it would be a fight to the death. Chapter 11. Alessia's Awakening of Power. The revelation of Lorenzo's treachery sent shockwaves through Alessia and Marcello. They struggled to comprehend the magnitude of his betrayal, the depth of his deception, the sheer ruthlessness of his ambition. Marcello, in particular, was devastated. He had idolized Lorenzo, had strived to emulate him, had sought his approval his entire life. To discover that Lorenzo was not only not his biological father, but also a cold-blooded manipulator, a traitor who had orchestrated the deaths of his own supposed allies, shattered his world. Alessia, while shocked by Lorenzo's actions, found herself strangely empowered by the revelation. She had always felt like an outsider, a pawn in a game controlled by others. Now, she realized that she was at the center of the conflict, that she had a crucial role to play, that she could use her intelligence, her courage, and her knowledge of both the DeSantis and Costa families to fight back. She began to see herself not as a victim, but as a survivor, a warrior, a leader. She embraced her DeSantis heritage, her innate strength, her strategic mind, her ability to navigate the treacherous world of the mafia. She also recognized the power of her unique position. She was the bridge between the two families, the link between the past and the future. She was the only one who could unite the remaining loyal members of both the DeSantis and Costa organizations to forge a new alliance, to fight against Lorenzo and the De Lucas. She started to take charge, to make decisions, to issue orders, her voice gaining authority, her presence commanding respect. She worked closely with Marcello, supporting him, guiding him, helping him to process his emotions and to channel his anger into a focused determination to defeat his father. They began to gather evidence of Lorenzo's crimes, meticulously documenting his illegal activities, his secret dealings, his betrayals. They used Alessia's knowledge of her father's network, Isabella's connections within the Costa family, and Marcello's access to the Costa organization's inner workings to build a case against Lorenzo. They also reached out to the remaining loyal Capi within the Costa family, those who had not been corrupted by Lorenzo's influence, those who still believed in the old values of honor, loyalty, and family. It was a risky move, a gamble that could expose their plans and put them in even greater danger. But Alessia's instincts were sharp, her judgment sound. She was able to identify the true loyalists, those who were disgusted by Lorenzo's treachery, those who were willing to fight for the future of the Costa family. She rallied them to their cause, inspiring them with her courage, her determination, her vision of a new alliance, a new order, a new future for both families. She spoke to them with passion, with conviction, with a power that surprised even herself. She was no longer the quiet, reserved, obedient mafia daughter. She was a leader, a strategist, a force to be reckoned with. She was Alessia DeSantis Costa, and she would not be defeated. She also began to explore her own abilities, her own potential. She realized that she had a gift for strategy, for negotiation, for understanding the complex dynamics of power. She had a natural instinct for the game, a keen eye for detail, a sharp mind that could anticipate her enemy's moves. She trained with Marcelo, learning hand-to-hand combat, weapons handling, the skills she would need to survive in their dangerous world. She discovered a hidden strength within herself, a physical prowess that matched her mental acuity. She was becoming a warrior, a protector, a defender of her family, her legacy, her future. She was awakening to her own power, a power that had been dormant, suppressed, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And that moment had arrived. The battle lines were drawn. Lorenzo Costa, Illinois Serpent, against Alessia and Marcelo, the unlikely alliance, the forbidden love, the hope for a new future. It was a clash of generations, a battle for control, a fight to the death. And Alessia was ready. She was no longer a pawn. She was a queen. And she would claim her throne. The awakening was complete. The power was hers. And she would use it to protect those she loved, to avenge those she had lost, to build a new world, a new order, a new future, on the ashes of the old. But would it be enough? Lorenzo was a formidable enemy, a master manipulator, a ruthless opponent. The odds were stacked against them. But Alessia was not afraid. She had found her strength, her purpose, her power. And she would not back down. Not now. Not ever. The game had changed. And Alessia was in control. Or so she believed. Chapter 12. Marcelo's hidden vulnerabilities. While Alessia blossomed into a leader, Marcelo grappled with the shattering of his world. The revelation of Lorenzo's identity as Il Serpent, coupled with the knowledge of his true parentage, left him adrift, questioning everything he had ever believed. His stoic facade, the carefully constructed mask of the impenetrable mafia don, began to crack, revealing the vulnerable man beneath. He struggled with feelings of betrayal, anger, and a profound sense of loss. Lorenzo, the man he had admired and strived to emulate, was a monster, a manipulator who had used him as a pawn in his twisted game. His biological father, Antonio DeSantis, was a man he had been taught to hate, a rival who had ultimately orchestrated his own son's unwitting participation in a deadly feud. Marcelo retreated inward, isolating himself from everyone, even Alessia. He spent hours alone, brooding, wrestling with his demons, his past, his shattered identity. He lost interest in the family business, neglecting his responsibilities, his focus consumed by the turmoil within him. Alessia watched him with growing concern, her heart aching for his pain, her own sense of empowerment tempered by her worry for his well-being. She tried to reach him, to offer comfort, to support him, but he pushed her away, his walls rebuilt, his emotions locked down. She understood his pain, his confusion, his need to process the devastating revelations. But she also knew that they couldn't afford to let his inner turmoil consume him. They were facing a formidable enemy, a ruthless opponent who would exploit any weakness, any vulnerability. She tried different approaches, sometimes gentle and understanding, sometimes firm and demanding, attempting to break through his defenses, to reach the man she knew was still there, beneath the layers of pain and anger. One evening, She found him in the villa's chapel, the same chapel where they had been married, a place that held both sacred and painful memories. He was sitting alone in the darkened sanctuary, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped, his body radiating a profound sense of despair. She approached him slowly, her footsteps silent on the stone floor, her presence a gentle intrusion into his solitude. She sat beside him, not speaking, simply offering her presence, her support, her silent understanding. He didn't acknowledge her at first, his gaze fixed on the floor, his mind lost in his own thoughts. Then, he spoke, his voice low, raspy, filled with a raw emotion she had never heard before. "I don't know who I am anymore," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Everything I believed, everything I was, it was all a lie." Alessia reached out, her hand gently touching his arm, a gesture of comfort, of connection. "You are Marcelo," she said, her voice soft, but firm. "You are the man I married, the man I trust, the man I care for." He turned to her, his eyes filled with pain, with confusion, with a vulnerability that tore at her heart. "But who is that man, Alessia?" he asked, his voice choked with emotion. "Am I a Costa? Am I a DeSantis? Am I a monster, like my father's?" She took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his, a symbol of their bond, their connection, their shared destiny. "You are you, Marcelo," she said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "You are not defined by your fathers, by their mistakes, by their betrayals. You are defined by your choices, by your actions, by the man you choose to be." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, seeking solace, seeking guidance, seeking a way out of the darkness that consumed him. "I don't know if I can do this, Alessia," he said, his voice trembling. "I don't know if I can face him, if I can fight him, if I can be the man you need me to be." She squeezed his hand, her grip firm, her gaze unwavering. "You can, Marcelo," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "You are stronger than you think. You are braver than you know. And you are not alone. I am here. We are in this together." Her words, her presence, her unwavering belief in him, seemed to reach him, to penetrate the walls he had built around his heart. He leaned his head against her shoulder, his body trembling, his emotions finally breaking free. He wept, silently, his tears a release of the pain, the anger, the grief he had been holding inside. Alessia held him, her arms wrapped around him, her body a source of comfort, of strength, of a love that was both forbidden and undeniable. In that moment, in the darkened chapel, their roles reversed. Alessia, the once timid wife, became the protector, the comforter, the pillar of strength. Marcelo, the once impenetrable Don, became the vulnerable, broken man, seeking solace in her arms. It was a turning point, a moment of profound connection, a revelation of their hidden vulnerabilities, a testament to the power of their love, their bond, their shared destiny. Marcelo's hidden vulnerabilities were exposed, but they did not weaken him. They made him human, relatable, real. And they strengthened his connection to Alessia, forging a bond that was deeper, stronger, more resilient than anything they had known before. It allowed him to be weak. It allowed her to be strong. He was broken, but he was not defeated. And with Alessia by his side, he would find the strength to fight, to overcome, to reclaim his identity, to forge his own destiny. But the battle was far from over. Lorenzo was waiting, and the price of victory would be high. But they were ready, together, vulnerable but strong, broken but not defeated. And their love, their bond, their shared destiny would be their greatest weapon. Or so they hoped. Chapter 13. A test of faith and forgiveness. With Marcelo slowly regaining his strength, fueled by Alessia's unwavering support and his own burgeoning resolve, they turned their attention to their most pressing problem, Lorenzo. They knew they couldn't confront him directly. He was too powerful, too well protected, and too deeply entrenched within the Costa organization. They needed a plan, a strategy that would expose his crimes, dismantle his power base, and ultimately bring him to justice, mafia justice. That is, This meant gathering irrefutable evidence, securing the loyalty of key figures within the Costa family, and preparing for a confrontation that could very well turn into a bloody internal war. Alessia, drawing on her father's old contacts and her own growing network of informants, discovered that Lorenzo had been secretly siphoning funds from the Costa family's legitimate businesses, laundering the money through a series of offshore accounts, and using it to finance his own clandestine operations, including his alliance with the De Lucas. This was the key, the leverage they needed. Exposing Lorenzo's financial crimes would not only discredit him in the eyes of his own capi, but also attract the attention of the other mafia families, who would see him as a threat to the established order, a rogue element that needed to be eliminated. Marcello, using his still considerable influence within the Costa organization, began to subtly undermine Lorenzo's authority, planting seeds of doubt among his lieutenants, questioning his decisions, and highlighting his increasingly erratic behavior. He did this carefully, cautiously, avoiding any direct confrontation, knowing that Lorenzo was still a dangerous and unpredictable opponent. Meanwhile, Isabella, grappling with the guilt of her initial suspicions and her subsequent relief at being exonerated, dedicated herself to helping Alessia and Marcello. She used her intimate knowledge of the Costa family's inner workings to identify Lorenzo's closest allies, his weaknesses, and his potential vulnerabilities. One evening, while reviewing Lorenzo's financial records, Alessia noticed a recurring pattern of payments to a specific individual, a name she didn't recognize, Sister Agnes. Intrigued, she delved deeper, discovering that Sister Agnes was the head of a small, obscure convent on the outskirts of the city. It seemed unlikely that Lorenzo, a ruthless mafia don, would be making charitable donations to a convent. Alessia's instincts told her that there was more to the story, that Sister Agnes was somehow connected to Lorenzo's secret dealings. She decided to investigate, to visit the convent, to speak to Sister Agnes, to uncover the truth. It was a risky move, a potential trap, but she felt compelled to follow her intuition. Marcello, initially hesitant, agreed to let her go, but insisted on providing her with protection. He assigned 2 of his most trusted men, seasoned bodyguards, to accompany her, with strict instructions to keep her safe at all costs. Alessia, dressed in simple, inconspicuous clothing, arrived at the convent, her heart pounding, her senses on high alert. The convent was a quiet, secluded place, surrounded by high walls and overgrown gardens, a world apart from the violence and chaos of the mafia. She was greeted by a young nun, her face serene, her eyes filled with a quiet peace. Alessia explained that she was interested in learning more about the convent's work, that she was considering making a donation. The young nun led her through the quiet corridors, the silence broken only by the faint sound of chanting, the air filled with the scent of incense and old stone. Alessia felt a sense of unease, a prickling at the back of her neck, a feeling that she was being watched, that something was not quite right. She was introduced to Sister Agnes, an elderly woman with a kind face, wrinkled skin, and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. Alessia explained her supposed interest in the convent, her desire to support their charitable work. Sister Agnes listened patiently, her gaze unwavering, her expression unreadable. Then, she smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down Alessia's spine. "We are always grateful for the generosity of others," Sister Agnes said, her voice soft but firm. "But we are also very careful about who we accept donations from." Alessia felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She knew that Sister Agnes was not fooled, that she knew the real reason for her visit. "I understand," Alessia said, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her heart. "I am not who I seem to be." Sister Agnes nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I know who you are, Alessia de Santos Costa," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "And I know why you're here." Alessia took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. "Then you know about Lorenzo," she said, her voice firm. "You know about his crimes." Sister Agnes was silent for a moment, her gaze searching Alessia's face, as if assessing her sincerity, her intentions. Then, she gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "I know more than you can imagine," she said, her voice filled with a weariness, a sadness, a hint of something else, fear. Sister Agnes revealed a shocking truth. She was not just a nun, she was Lorenzo's sister, his confidant, his keeper of secrets. She had helped him conceal his crimes, launder his money, and maintain his power. But she had also grown disillusioned with him, disgusted by his ruthlessness, his greed, his betrayal of his own family. She was tired of the lies, the violence, the endless cycle of death and destruction. She had been waiting for an opportunity to expose him, to bring him to justice, to end his reign of terror. And Alessia was that opportunity. She provided Alessia with the evidence that they are looking for. Sister Agnes gave Alessia a small, locked box containing detailed records of Lorenzo's illegal activities, his financial transactions, his secret dealings with the DeLucas, and his plans for the future. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the irrefutable proof they needed to bring him down. The box was heavy, not because of the physical object. It was a test of faith and a plea of forgiveness. Alessia thanked Sister Agnes, her heart filled with a mixture of gratitude and relief. She had found an unexpected ally, a woman of faith, a woman of courage, a woman who had chosen to betray her own brother to save others. As Alessia left the convent, she felt a sense of hope, of renewed determination. The tide was turning. They had the evidence, they had the allies, they had the plan. But would it be enough to defeat Lorenzo, a man who had spent his entire life mastering the art of deception, of manipulation, of violence? The answer remained uncertain. But one thing was clear. The test of faith had been passed, and the plea for forgiveness had been heard. The final confrontation was approaching, and the stakes were higher than ever. Chapter 14. The Masks We Wear for Survival. Armed with Sister Agnes's evidence, Alessia and Marcello prepared for the final confrontation with Lorenzo. They knew it wouldn't be easy. Lorenzo still controlled a significant portion of the Costa family, and he had the DeLucas at his back. They needed to move strategically, carefully, and swiftly. Their plan was to present the evidence to the Commission, the governing body of the mafia families in the city. The Commission, comprised of the heads of the most powerful families, was responsible for maintaining order, resolving disputes, and enforcing the rules of their world. Exposing Lorenzo's crimes to the Commission would, they hoped, strip him of his legitimacy, isolate him from his allies, and ultimately lead to his downfall. But getting an audience with the Commission was no easy task. Lorenzo had influence within the body, allies who would protect him, enemies who would use the situation to their advantage. Alessia and Marcello needed to secure the support of at least a few key members, powerful dons who would be willing to listen to their evidence and take action against Lorenzo. Isabella, using her extensive network of contacts and her deep understanding of the intricate web of mafia politics, identified two potential allies: Don Salvatore Romano, an old-school mafia boss who valued honor and tradition above all else, and Donatella Vergani, a shrewd and ambitious woman who had recently taken over her family's operations after her father's death. Alessia and Marcello arranged secret meetings with Don Romano and Donatella, presenting them with Sister Agnes's evidence and outlining Lorenzo's crimes. It was a delicate dance, a negotiation fraught with danger, a test of their credibility and their persuasive powers. Don Romano, a man of few words and even fewer displays of emotion, listened intently, his eyes narrowed, his face unreadable. He was skeptical at first, questioning the authenticity of the evidence, challenging Alessia and Marcello's motives. But as he reviewed the documents, as he heard their impassioned pleas, as he saw the genuine fear and determination in their eyes, he began to believe them. Donatella Vergani, on the other hand, was more calculating, more pragmatic. She saw an opportunity to advance her own family's interests, to weaken the Costas, to gain a foothold in the lucrative territories controlled by Lorenzo. She agreed to support Alessia and Marcello, but only in exchange for certain concessions, certain guarantees that would benefit her family in the long run. With the backing of Don Romano and Donatella, Alessia and Marcello secured an audience with the Commission. It was a momentous occasion, a gathering of the most powerful mafia figures in the city, a scene filled with tension, suspicion, and the ever-present threat of violence. The meeting was held in a neutral location, a grand, opulent villa that belonged to none of the families involved, a symbol of impartiality, of the commission's authority. Alessia and Marcello arrived, accompanied by Isabella and a small contingent of their most trusted men, their faces masks of composure, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. Lorenzo was already there, surrounded by his loyal Capi, his expression arrogant, confident, seemingly unfazed by the accusations against him. He greeted Marcello with a cold, dismissive nod, his eyes filled with a mixture of contempt and a barely concealed threat. The meeting began with a formal presentation of the evidence. Alessia, stepping forward, addressed the commission, her voice clear, steady, her gaze unwavering. She outlined Lorenzo's crimes, his financial manipulations, his secret dealings with the De Lucas, his betrayal of his own family, his violation of the sacred rules of the mafia. She presented Sister Agnes's box, its contents spread out on the long table, a damning indictment of Lorenzo's treachery. The documents spoke for themselves, the evidence irrefutable, the truth undeniable. Lorenzo, initially dismissive, began to show signs of unease, his arrogance fading, his confidence crumbling. He tried to interrupt, to deny the accusations, to discredit Alessia and Marcello, but his words were hollow, his arguments weak, his lies transparent. The members of the commission, initially skeptical, began to turn against him. They saw the evidence, they heard the testimony, they recognized the truth. Lorenzo, the once powerful Don, was exposed, his mask of respectability shattered, his reign of terror nearing its end. But Lorenzo was not one to go down without a fight. He had one last card to play, a desperate gamble to save himself, to turn the tables on his accusers. He revealed a secret, a shocking truth that he had kept hidden for years, a weapon he had intended to use only as a last resort. "Marcello is not my son," Lorenzo declared, his voice booming, filling the room, his eyes fixed on Marcello, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "He is Antonio DeSantis' son. He is a bastard, a product of a forbidden union, a traitor planted within my family to destroy me." The room erupted in chaos, the members of the commission stunned, shocked, their faces a mixture of disbelief and outrage. Marcello, reeling from the public revelation of his true parentage, stared at Lorenzo, his heart pounding, his mind racing. Alessia, however, was not surprised. She had known the truth, had prepared for this moment. She stepped forward, her voice calm, her gaze unwavering, her presence commanding. "It is true," she said, her voice ringing out in the silent room. "Marcello is Antonio DeSantis' son. But he is not a traitor. He is a victim of Lorenzo's manipulations, a pawn in his twisted game. He is innocent of any wrongdoing." She turned to Marcello, her eyes filled with love, with compassion, with a fierce determination to protect him. "You are not defined by your parentage, Marcello," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You are defined by your choices, by your actions, by the man you are today." The commission, swayed by Alessia's words, by her unwavering belief in Marcello, by the overwhelming evidence against Lorenzo, made their decision. Lorenzo Costa was stripped of his power, his position, his authority. He was declared an enemy of the mafia, a traitor to be hunted down and eliminated. His allies deserted him, his Capi turned against him, his empire crumbling around him. The masks were off, the truth was revealed, and the price of survival had been paid. But the game was not over. Lorenzo, cornered, desperate, would not surrender. He would fight. He would kill. He would do anything to survive. And Alessia and Marcello would have to be ready for the final battle, for the ultimate showdown, for the fight of their lives. The masks were off, but the danger remained. And the stakes were higher than ever. Chapter 15. Blood Ties and Broken Promises. Lorenzo's condemnation by the commission was swift, but his escape was even swifter. Before the assembled Dons could seize him, a carefully orchestrated diversion, a series of explosions and coordinated attacks on the villa's perimeter allowed Lorenzo and a handful of his most loyal men to flee. The meeting erupted in chaos. The Dons, enraged by Lorenzo's defiance and the blatant attack on their authority, immediately ordered a city-wide manhunt. But Lorenzo, a master of planning and deception, had vanished. He had anticipated the commission's verdict and prepared his escape route, leaving Alessia and Marcello with a Pyrrhic victory. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of activity. Alessia and Marcello, with Isabella's help, worked to consolidate their control over the remaining Costa loyalists, reassuring them of their commitment to stability and honor, and promising a new era of cooperation between the former DeSantis and Costa territories. But the threat of Lorenzo loomed large. He was wounded, cornered, but far from defeated. He still had allies, resources, and a burning desire for revenge. Alessia and Marcello knew that he would strike back, and they had to be prepared. They fortified their defenses, increased security, and began to hunt for Lorenzo, using their combined network of informants and their growing understanding of his methods and hideouts. It was a tense, dangerous cat-and-mouse game, with the city itself becoming the chessboard. Amidst this turmoil, Marcello struggled with the public revelation of his true parentage. While Alessia had prepared him for it, the experience of hearing Lorenzo denounce him as a bastard and a traitor before the assembled mafia elite was deeply scarring. He found himself questioning his identity, his place in the world, and even his relationship with Alessia. One evening, as they sat together in the relative safety of the old DeSantis estate, Marcello confessed his doubts. "I don't belong anywhere, Alessia," he said, his voice heavy with despair. "I'm not a Costa, not truly a DeSantis. I'm a ghost, a shadow, a product of lies and betrayal." Alessia took his hand, her grip firm, her eyes filled with compassion. "You belong with me, Marcello," she said, her voice unwavering. "You are the man I married, the man I love. Your bloodline doesn't define you, your actions do. And you have chosen to fight for what is right, for justice, for a better future." Marcello looked at her, his eyes searching hers, seeking solace and reassurance. He saw not only love and compassion, but also a fierce determination, a strength that he desperately needed to draw upon. "But what about us?" he asked, his voice hesitant, his gaze dropping to their intertwined hands. We're brother and sister, Alessia. It's forbidden." Alessia didn't flinch. She had anticipated this question, had grappled with the moral and societal implications of their relationship. She had come to a decision, a conviction that she would not waver from. "We are husband and wife, Marcello," she said, her voice firm. "We were married before we knew the truth. And our love, our connection, it transcends bloodlines, it transcends the rules of this world. We choose each other, and that's all that matters." Her words, her unwavering belief in their love, gave Marcello a renewed sense of hope, a reason to keep fighting. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that was both passionate and tender, a reaffirmation of their bond, their commitment, their defiance of the constraints imposed upon them. But their moment of peace was shattered by a sudden, urgent message. One of their informants had located Lorenzo. He was hiding in an abandoned warehouse on the docks, preparing to flee the city by boat. This was their chance. They had to act quickly, decisively, before Lorenzo escaped and became an even greater threat. Alessia and Marcello, with a small contingent of their most trusted men, prepared for a final confrontation. They knew it would be dangerous, potentially deadly, but they were ready. They were fighting for their lives, for their love, for their future. It was time to break all the promises. The old promises, made in blood and deceit. They armed themselves, checked their weapons, and exchanged a look, a silent promise of loyalty, of protection, of unwavering love. They were ready to face Lorenzo, to end his reign of terror, to finally break free from the chains of the past. Blood ties would be tested. Broken promises would be avenged. And the future, uncertain as it was, would be forged in the crucible of this final battle. They were ready, or so they thought. Lorenzo was waiting, and he had a few surprises of his own. The docks were shrouded in darkness, and the air was thick with the scent of salt, of blood, and of betrayal. The final act was about to begin. Chapter 16. The Tangled Web of Mafia Alliances. The warehouse loomed before them, a hulking silhouette against the inky blackness of the harbor. The air was thick with the smell of salt and decay, the silence punctuated only by the gentle lapping of waves against the pilings and the distant cries of seagulls. Alessia and Marcello, flanked by their men, moved cautiously, their senses on high alert. They knew Lorenzo was inside, waiting for them. He was a cornered animal, desperate and dangerous, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. They also suspected he wouldn't be alone. The DeLucas, eager to exploit the chaos within the Costa family, would likely be there, lending their support to Lorenzo in a final, desperate attempt to seize power. As they approached the warehouse, the faint sounds of activity reached their ears, muffled voices, the clinking of metal, the creak of old wood. They exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of the danger ahead, a reaffirmation of their commitment to each other. Marcello signaled his men, splitting them into two groups. One group, led by him, would approach the main entrance, creating a diversion. The other group, led by Alessia and supported by Isabella, would circle around to the back, attempting to infiltrate the warehouse through a less obvious entry point. It was a risky plan, but it was their best chance to catch Lorenzo off guard and prevent him from escaping. They knew that a direct assault would be costly, likely resulting in heavy casualties on both sides. Alessia and Isabella, moving silently through the shadows, reached the back of the warehouse. They found a small, rusted door, partially hidden by a pile of discarded fishing nets. It was locked, but one of their men, a skilled locksmith, quickly picked it, the tumblers clicking softly in the night. They slipped inside, the darkness enveloping them. The air was thick with the smell of fish, oil, and something metallic, something that made Alessia's stomach churn. Blood. They moved cautiously through the dimly lit interior, their weapons drawn, their senses straining to detect any sign of movement, any hint of danger. The warehouse was a labyrinth of corridors, stacked crates, and abandoned machinery, a perfect place for an ambush. They heard voices, muffled but agitated, coming from the far end of the warehouse. Lorenzo, and others. They were arguing, their tones heated, their words indistinguishable. Alessia signaled her men to hold their position. She crept forward, alone, using the shadows as cover, her heart pounding, her adrenaline surging. She needed to assess the situation, to identify the enemy, to gauge their numbers and their preparedness. She reached a corner, peering cautiously around it. She saw Lorenzo, his face contorted with rage, arguing with several men. She recognized them. Don Carlo DeLuca, the head of the DeLuca family, and his two sons, Marco and Giovanni. The DeLucas were there, as expected, lending their support to Lorenzo, their alliance forged in a shared desire for power, for control, for the destruction of the DeSantis and Costa families. Alessia also saw something else, something that made her blood run cold. Several of Marcello's men she thought were loyal, were standing with Lorenzo and the DeLucas, their weapons trained on the entrance where Marcello was expected to arrive. Betrayal. Again. Lorenzo had not only escaped the commission, he had also managed to turn some of Marcello's own men against him. He had planted spies, saboteurs, traitors within their ranks, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. Alessia realized that Marcello was walking into a trap, a carefully orchestrated ambush that could very well cost him his life. She had to warn him, to stop him, before it was too late. She turned to retreat, to alert her men, to find a way to contact Marcello. But it was too late. A voice, cold and menacing, stopped her in her tracks. Going somewhere, Alessia? She turned, slowly, her heart pounding, her weapon raised. Standing before her, a cruel smile twisting his lips, was Lorenzo Costa. He had anticipated her move, had been waiting for her, had used her own plan against her. He was not alone. Several of his loyal men, along with the DeLucas, surrounded her, their weapons trained on her, their faces grim, their intentions clear. She was trapped, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that the tangled web of mafia alliances had just tightened around her, around Marcello, around their future. The battle had begun. But it was not the battle they had expected. It was a trap, a betrayal, a fight for survival against overwhelming odds. And Alessia, alone, surrounded by enemies, had to find a way to fight back, to warn Marcello, to save them both from the deadly web that Lorenzo had spun. The odds were stacked against her. But she was a DeSantis, and a Costa, and she would not surrender.
Not now.
Not ever. But how could she escape? How could she warn Marcello? How could she survive? The answers were unclear. But one thing was certain. The night was far from over. And the price of betrayal would be high. Chapter 17. Alessia's choice. Love or duty. Lorenzo's smile widened, a predatory gleam in his eyes. Welcome, Alessia, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. I've been expecting you. Alessia stood her ground, her weapon held firmly, her gaze unwavering. She refused to show fear, to give him the satisfaction of seeing her intimidated. You won't get away with this, Lorenzo, she said, her voice cold, defiant. Lorenzo chuckled, a low, throaty sound that sent a shiver down her spine. Get away with what, my dear? He asked, his voice mocking. Exposing your husband's true parentage? Eliminating a rival family? Consolidating my power? You're a monster, Lorenzo, Alessia said, her voice filled with disgust. You betray everyone, even your own family. Lorenzo's smile faded, his eyes hardening. Family?
He scoffed.
Family is a weakness, Alessia. A liability. Loyalty is an illusion. Power is the only thing that matters. He gestured towards the DeLucas, who stood behind him, their faces grim, their weapons trained on Alessia.
These are my true allies, he said.
Men who understand the game, who know the price of power, who are willing to do whatever it takes to achieve their goals. Alessia glanced at the DeLucas, her mind racing, assessing the situation. She was outnumbered, outgunned, surrounded by enemies. Her chances of escape were slim, her chances of survival even slimmer. But she wouldn't give up. She had to find a way to warn Marcello, to prevent him from walking into the trap that Lorenzo had set. Marcello will stop you, she said, her voice firm, her gaze fixed on Lorenzo. He will expose your crimes. He will bring you to justice. Lorenzo laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Marcello?
He scoffed.
He is a weakling, Alessia. A fool. He is blinded by his sentimentality, his misplaced loyalty, his affection for you. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper, his breath warm against her ear. He is in love with his sister, Alessia, he said, his voice laced with venom. A forbidden love, a shameful secret, a weakness that I will exploit. Alessia flinched, but she didn't back down. She met his gaze, her eyes filled with defiance. Our love is not a weakness, Lorenzo, she said, her voice steady. It is our strength. It is what binds us together, what gives us the courage to fight, what will ultimately defeat you. Lorenzo's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. He raised his hand, signaling his men. Enough talk, he said, his voice cold, devoid of emotion.
Kill her.
The men around her tightened their grip on their weapons, their fingers moving to the triggers. Alessia knew that this was it, the end of the line, the moment of truth. But she wouldn't go down without a fight. She raised her weapon, aiming at Lorenzo, her finger tightening on the trigger. Suddenly, a voice rang out, clear and strong, cutting through the tension. Drop your weapons, Lorenzo. It's over. It was Marcello. He had somehow escaped the trap, had managed to circle around and enter the warehouse through another entrance. He stood at the far end of the room, his weapon trained on Lorenzo, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of rage and determination. He was not alone. Several of his loyal men, along with Isabella and her contingent, stood beside him, their weapons also trained on Lorenzo and the DeLucas. The situation had shifted. The tables had turned. Lorenzo was no longer in control, but the danger was far from over. The warehouse was filled with armed men, loyalties divided, tensions high, the threat of violence palpable. A standoff. A moment of silence, heavy with anticipation, with the unspoken threat of a bloody confrontation. Lorenzo, his face contorted with rage, glared at Marcello. "You should have stayed away, boy," he snarled. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me very much, father," Marcello replied, his voice cold, his gaze unwavering. "You have betrayed your family, you have murdered innocent people, you have allied yourself with our enemies. You will pay for your crimes." Lorenzo laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You think you can defeat me, Marcello?"
He scoffed.
"You are weak, sentimental, a fool blinded by love." He turned to Alessia, his eyes filled with a cruel, knowing smile. "He loves you, Alessia," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "He loves his sister. He would do anything for you, even betray his own family." He turned back to Marcello, his voice hardening. "Make a choice, Marcello," he said, his voice commanding. "Her or your family. Your life or hers. You can't have both." It was a cruel ultimatum, a test of loyalty, a choice between love and duty. Lorenzo was forcing Marcello to choose between Alessia and his own men, between his heart and his heritage, between his love and his life. Alessia had to do something. Marcello hesitated, his gaze flickering between Alessia and Lorenzo, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He was torn, conflicted, trapped between his love for Alessia and his loyalty to his men, to his family, to his heritage. He couldn't make that decision. Alessia knew what she had to do. She couldn't let Marcello sacrifice himself for her. She couldn't let him choose between his love and his duty. She had to make the choice for him. She stepped out, towards her husband, and towards her enemy, his father. "Lorenzo, don't do it, Marcello. I choose you." It was a lie, but a needed one. She lowered her weapon, a gesture of surrender, a sacrifice for the man she loved. She would give herself up, to save him, to save his men, to save their future. It was the only way. Love or duty. She chose duty. The duty to protect the man she loved, even if it meant sacrificing herself. But would it work? Would Lorenzo accept her surrender? Would Marcello let her go? The answers were uncertain. But one thing was clear. Alessia had made her choice. And the consequences would be devastating. Or so she thought. Chapter 18. Marcello's Revelation of the Heart. Marcello watched in horror as Alessia lowered her weapon, offering herself as a sacrifice. His mind screamed in protest, his heart aching with a pain so intense it felt like a physical wound. He couldn't let her do it. He couldn't let Lorenzo win. He couldn't lose her. "Alessia, no," he shouted, his voice raw with emotion, his weapon still trained on Lorenzo. But Alessia didn't waver. She met his gaze, her eyes filled with love, with determination, with a silent plea for him to understand. "It's the only way, Marcello," she said, her voice soft, but firm. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself for me." Lorenzo smiled, a cruel, triumphant smile. "Such a touching display of devotion," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But it's futile, Alessia. You can't save him. You can't save any of them." He gestured towards his men, and towards the DeLucas, who still had their weapons trained on Alessia and Marcello. "Kill them all," he ordered, his voice cold, devoid of emotion. But before his men could react, before the DeLucas could pull the triggers, Marcello did something unexpected. Something that shocked everyone in the warehouse, including Alessia. He lowered his weapon. "No," he said, his voice clear, strong, resonating through the silent warehouse. "I won't let you kill her. And I won't let you kill my men." He turned to his men, his gaze sweeping across their faces, his expression firm, his voice commanding. "Stand down," he ordered. "This is not our fight." His men hesitated, confused, uncertain. They had been trained to obey his orders, to follow him without question. But this order, this command to stand down, to betray their supposed allies, to defy Lorenzo, it was unprecedented. "What are you doing, Marcello?" Lorenzo shouted, his voice filled with rage, his face contorted with disbelief. "Have you lost your mind?" Marcello ignored him. He continued to address his men, his voice calm, but firm, his gaze unwavering. "Lorenzo Costa is not our leader," he said. "He is a traitor, a murderer, a man who has betrayed everything we stand for. I will not follow him, and I will not ask you to follow him." He paused, his gaze sweeping across their faces again, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and determination. "I know this is a difficult decision," he said, "but I ask you to trust me. Ask you to choose loyalty, not to a man, but to an ideal. To the ideal of family, of honor, of justice." His words, his courage, his unwavering belief in what was right, had an effect. His men, one by one, began to lower their weapons, their faces a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had been torn between their loyalty to Marcello and their fear of Lorenzo, but Marcello's words had given them the courage to choose the right path. The De Lucas, seeing their allies desert them, became increasingly agitated. They realized that they were outnumbered, outgunned, their plan to seize power crumbling around them. Don Carlo De Luca, his face a mask of fury, turned to Lorenzo. "You promised us victory," he snarled. "You promised us control. You lied to us." Lorenzo, his face pale, his eyes filled with a desperate fear, tried to regain control of the situation. "We can still win," he insisted. "We can still fight. We can still kill them all." But it was too late. His own men had turned against him. The De Lucas were abandoning him, and Marcello stood before him, his weapon raised, his eyes filled with a cold, unwavering determination. "It's over, Lorenzo," Marcello said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You have lost." Lorenzo, cornered, desperate, his empire crumbling around him, made one last, desperate move. He lunged at Alessia, grabbing her, holding her hostage, a knife pressed to her throat. "Don't move, Marcello," he shouted, his voice frantic, his eyes wild. "Or I'll kill her." Marcello froze, his weapon lowered slightly, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't risk Alessia's life. He couldn't lose her. "Let her go, Lorenzo," he said, his voice low, pleading. "This is between you and me. Don't involve her." Lorenzo laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "It's always been about her, Marcello," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You love her. And that's your weakness. That's why you'll always lose." He tightened his grip on Alessia, the knife pressing deeper into her skin, a thin line of blood appearing on her neck. Marcello felt a surge of rage, a primal instinct to protect the woman he loved. He raised his weapon, aiming at Lorenzo, his finger tightening on the trigger. But he hesitated. He couldn't risk hitting Alessia. He couldn't take the shot. He was about to, but he didn't have to. A gunshot rang out, loud and clear, echoing through the warehouse. Lorenzo gasped, his eyes widening in shock, his grip on Alessia loosening. He staggered backward, his hand clutching his chest, blood spreading across his shirt. He collapsed to the floor, his body still, his eyes vacant. He was dead. Marcello and Alessia stared in shock, their minds struggling to comprehend what had just happened. They looked around, searching for the source of the shot. Standing at the entrance of the warehouse, a smoking gun in her hand, was Isabella. She had fired the shot that killed Lorenzo. She had saved Alessia. She had saved Marcello. She had ended the reign of terror. She had avenged her brother. Isabella, the quiet, reserved aunt. The woman they had both suspected. The woman who had ultimately proven her loyalty, her courage, her love for her family. The revelation was stunning. The heart had spoken. But the battle was over. Lorenzo was dead. The De Lucas were defeated. And Alessia and Marcello were safe.
For now.
But the cost had been high. And the future was uncertain. But one thing was clear. Love had triumphed. Loyalty had been rewarded. And the truth, however painful, had set them free. Or so they hoped. The warehouse was silent, save for the sound of Alessia's and Marcello's breathing, the echoes of the gunshot, and the weight of the unspoken words. They had survived. But at what cost? And what would the future hold? The answers remained hidden. But they were together. And that was all that mattered.
For now.
Chapter 19. The Brink of War and Redemption. The aftermath of Lorenzo's death was a chaotic mix of relief, grief, and the daunting task of rebuilding. The De Lucas, their alliance with Lorenzo shattered, and their own power significantly weakened, retreated, licking their wounds and vowing revenge. The Commission, shaken by the events that had transpired, recognized Marcello as the rightful head of the Costa family and acknowledged the union of the Costa and DeSantis territories under his and Alessia's leadership. But the peace was fragile, a thin veneer over a simmering cauldron of resentment, ambition, and the ever-present threat of renewed conflict. Other families, sensing an opportunity, began to encroach on the newly unified territories, testing the strength of Marcello and Alessia's leadership, probing for weaknesses. Marcello, still grappling with the revelation of his true parentage and the trauma of Lorenzo's betrayal, struggled to consolidate his power. He was a reluctant leader, thrust into a position he had never sought, burdened by the weight of responsibility and the legacy of violence he had inherited. Alessia, however, thrived in her new role. She embraced her position as co-leader, using her intelligence, her strategic mind, and her growing network of informants to navigate the treacherous world of mafia politics. She became the driving force behind their efforts to rebuild, to stabilize their territories, and to prepare for the inevitable challenges that lay ahead. She also worked tirelessly to heal the rifts within the Costa family, to reassure the loyal Capi who had remained true to Marcello, and to integrate the former DeSantis loyalists into the new, unified organization. It was a delicate balancing act, requiring diplomacy, firmness, and a deep understanding of the complex dynamics of mafia culture. Isabella, her role in Lorenzo's death a closely guarded secret, became a trusted advisor to both Alessia and Marcello. She provided invaluable insights into the inner workings of the mafia world, her years of experience, and her intimate knowledge of the family's histories proving crucial in navigating the treacherous political landscape. One of the most pressing challenges they faced was the threat of the De Lucas. Don Carlo De Luca, humiliated and enraged by his defeat at the warehouse, was determined to avenge himself, to reclaim his lost territories, and to destroy Marcello and Alessia. He began to mobilize his forces, recruiting allies from other disgruntled families and preparing for an all-out war. Alessia and Marcello knew that they couldn't afford to wait for the De Lucas to strike. They had to take the initiative, to preempt their attack, to show them that they were not to be trifled with. They devised a plan, a daring and risky strategy that involved a combination of diplomacy, deception, and a carefully orchestrated show of force. They reached out to the other families on the commission, appealing to their sense of self-preservation, warning them of the dangers of allowing the De Lucas to gain too much power. They also used their network of informants to gather intelligence on the De Lucas movements, their plans, their weaknesses. They discovered that Don Carlo was planning to launch a surprise attack on several key Costa and DeSantis territories, hoping to overwhelm their defenses and seize control before Marcello and Alessia could react. Armed with this knowledge, Alessia and Marcello prepared their defenses, mobilizing their forces, strengthening their fortifications, and setting traps for the unsuspecting De Lucas. They also decided to send a message, a clear and unmistakable warning to Don Carlo and his allies. They orchestrated a series of targeted strikes against De Luca-controlled businesses, disrupting their operations, seizing their assets, and demonstrating their ability to reach out and touch them at will. It was a dangerous game, a high-stakes gamble that could easily escalate into a full-blown war. But Alessia and Marcello were determined to show the De Lucas, and the rest of the mafia world, that they were not to be underestimated, that they were willing to fight to protect their territories, their families, and their future. The tension in the city was palpable, the air thick with anticipation, with the unspoken threat of violence. Everyone knew that a war was brewing, that the fragile peace was about to shatter, that the streets would soon run red with blood. As the day of the planned DeLuca attack approached, Alessia and Marcello found themselves on the brink of war, their forces poised for battle, their hearts filled with a mixture of fear and determination. They stood together, on the rooftop of the old DeSantis estate, overlooking the city, the lights twinkling below them, a deceptive calm masking the turmoil that was about to erupt. Marcello turned to Alessia, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and concern. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, his voice low, his gaze unwavering. Alessia met his gaze, her chin lifted, her eyes shining with a fierce determination. "I was born ready, Marcello," she said, her voice firm, her hand reaching for his. "We are in this together. And we will win." Their fingers intertwined, a symbol of their unity, their strength, their unwavering love. They were ready to face the storm, to fight for their future, to redeem the past. The brink of war, and the promise of redemption. It was all on the line. Their lives, their love, their future, and they would face it together. Fearless, determined, united. But would it be enough? The DeLucas were coming, and the city was about to explode. The final battle was about to begin, and the outcome was far from certain. But they would fight. For each other, for their families, for their future, and they would not surrender.
Not now.
Not ever. The war had begun. Or so it seemed. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. The DeLuca attack came swiftly and brutally. Under the cover of darkness, their forces struck simultaneously at multiple locations across the Costa and DeSantis territories, aiming to overwhelm their defenses and seize control before Alessia and Marcello could react. But Alessia and Marcello had anticipated the attack. They had prepared their defenses, positioned their men strategically, and set traps for the unsuspecting DeLucas. The initial assault was met with fierce resistance, the DeLuca forces encountering heavy fire, booby traps, and well-coordinated counterattacks. The city erupted in violence. Gunfire echoed through the streets, explosions rocked buildings, and the screams of the dying mingled with the shouts of the combatants. It was a brutal, chaotic, all-out war, a fight for survival, a struggle for control of the city's underworld. Alessia and Marcello, leading their forces from the front lines, fought with a courage and determination that inspired their men. They moved from location to location, coordinating their defenses, rallying their troops, and engaging in direct combat with the enemy. Alessia, despite her lack of formal combat training, proved to be a natural fighter. She wielded her weapon with skill and precision, her movements fluid, her instincts sharp, her courage unwavering. She fought alongside her men, risking her life to protect them, to defend her territories, to secure her future. Marcello, fueled by a mixture of rage, grief, and a burning desire for justice, fought with a ferocity that surprised even himself. He was a whirlwind of motion, his weapon a blur, his attacks relentless, his determination absolute. He was fighting not only for his family, for his territories, but also for Alessia, for their love, for their future. The battle raged throughout the night, the outcome uncertain, the casualties mounting on both sides. The DeLucas, despite their initial surprise advantage, found themselves struggling against the well-prepared and fiercely determined Costa and DeSantis forces. Don Carlo DeLuca, realizing that his plan was failing, that his forces were being decimated, that he was on the verge of losing everything, decided to make one last, desperate gamble. He ordered his men to converge on the old DeSantis estate, the symbolic heart of the newly unified territories, the place where Alessia and Marcello had made their stand. He knew that if he could capture or kill Alessia and Marcello, he could break the resistance, demoralize their troops, and ultimately seize control. It was a risky move, a desperate all-or-nothing gamble, but he was out of options. Alessia and Marcello, alerted to the DeLuca advance on the estate, prepared for a final showdown. They gathered their remaining forces, fortified their defenses, and waited for the enemy to arrive. The DeLucas attacked the estate with a savage intensity, their numbers overwhelming, their determination fueled by desperation and a thirst for revenge. The fighting was brutal, hand-to-hand combat, a chaotic melee of gunfire, explosions, and the clash of steel. Alessia and Marcello fought side by side, their love for each other, their shared purpose, their unwavering commitment to their families, giving them strength and courage. They were a formidable team, their skills complementing each other, their movements synchronized, their determination absolute. But the DeLucas were relentless, their numbers seemingly endless. Alessia and Marcello's forces, exhausted and depleted, began to fall back, their defenses crumbling, their hopes fading. Don Carlo DeLuca, seeing his chance, pushed forward, his eyes fixed on Alessia and Marcello, his weapon raised, his finger tightening on the trigger. He was about to fire, to end it all, to claim his victory. But before he could pull the trigger, a figure emerged from the shadows, a figure that nobody expected. Isabella. She had been hiding, waiting for the opportune moment, her loyalty unwavering, her courage unquestionable. She raised her own weapon, a small but deadly pistol, and fired a single shot. The bullet struck Don Carlo DeLuca in the chest, piercing his heart, killing him instantly. He collapsed to the ground, his body still, his eyes vacant, his reign of terror over. The remaining DeLucas, seeing their leader dead, their attack faltering, their hopes of victory shattered, surrendered. The battle was over. The war was won. Alessia and Marcello had prevailed. They had defeated their enemies, secured their territories, and protected their families. But the victory was bittersweet. The cost had been high. Many lives had been lost, many wounds had been inflicted, and the scars of the battle would remain for years to come. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. It was over. They stood, victorious. They embraced, their bodies trembling, their hearts pounding, their love for each other a beacon of hope in the darkness. They had survived. They had triumphed. They had redeemed the past. And they had secured their future. Together. But the city was silent, the echoes of the battle fading, and the weight of the victory settling upon them. They had won. But at what cost? And what would the future hold? The answers remained uncertain. But one thing was clear. They were together. And that was all that mattered.
For now.
And forever. The war was over. But the healing had just begun. And the future, uncertain as it was theirs to shape. Together. Always. Epilogue. The years that followed were a time of rebuilding, of healing, and of forging a new future. Alessia and Marcello, working side by side, consolidated their power, uniting the Costa and DeSantis families under a single banner, a symbol of strength, resilience, and a commitment to a more just and equitable future. They honored the traditions of their families, but they also broke with the past, rejecting the cycle of violence and betrayal that had plagued their ancestors. They established new rules, new codes of conduct, prioritizing loyalty, honor, and respect above all else. They invested in their communities, creating jobs, supporting education, and fostering a sense of hope and opportunity for those who had long been marginalized and oppressed. They used their wealth and influence not to exploit and control, but to uplift and empower. They also sought justice for the crimes of the past. They cooperated with the authorities, providing information and evidence that led to the arrest and prosecution of corrupt officials, crooked politicians, and members of rival families who had engaged in illegal activities. They did all of this while navigating the complex and often treacherous world of mafia politics. They faced challenges, threats, and betrayals, but they met them with courage, determination, and an unwavering commitment to their vision of a better future. Isabella, her role in the deaths of Lorenzo and Don Carlo remaining a closely guarded secret, became a trusted advisor and a beloved member of their extended family. She found peace and redemption in her service to others, dedicating her life to helping those in need, atoning for the sins of the past. Alessia and Marcello, despite the unconventional and initially forbidden nature of their relationship, found happiness and fulfillment in their love for each other. They were soulmates, partners, equals. Their bond forged in the crucible of shared adversity, their love a testament to the power of forgiveness, redemption, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. They had children, a son and a daughter, who grew up in a world vastly different from the one their parents had known. They were raised with love, respect, and a strong sense of justice, instilled with the values of their parents, the hope for a future free from violence and betrayal. As the years passed, Alessia and Marcello became legends, their story told and retold, their names whispered with a mixture of awe and respect. They were the couple who had defied the odds, who had overcome betrayal and adversity, who had built a new world on the ashes of the old. One evening, many years later, Alessia and Marcello, their hair now silvered with age, their bodies bearing the scars of their past battles, sat together on the terrace of the old DeSantis estate, overlooking the city they had helped to rebuild. The city lights twinkled below them, a symbol of hope, of progress, of a future they had fought so hard to secure. Marcello took Alessia's hand, his grip still firm, his eyes filled with a love that had only deepened with time. "We did it, Alessia," he said, his voice soft, but filled with emotion. "We made it." Alessia smiled, her eyes meeting his, her heart overflowing with love and gratitude. "We did it together, Marcello," she said, her voice unwavering. "And we always will." They sat in silence, their hands clasped, their hearts connected, their love a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a symbol of a future they had built together, a future filled with peace, justice, and a love that had conquered all. The sun set. A new day would dawn, and their legacy would live on. Forever. The end.